Today, got it, Shira?
We're good.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, so our goal is to study Sefer Tehilim. That's why we are all here. Sefer Tehilim, I think one of the ways that I view it is very similar to the way that I view the first time a person goes to the kotel.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. So sorry, technical difficulties. Okay,
the first time a person goes to the kotel, there's generally beforehand quite a bit of expectation, right? It's supposed to be this uplifting spiritual experience where, you know, they feel like they're going to be a changed person after that first experience at the kotel. And for some people, I would dare say more than just some, because of all the buildup, there is this sometimes unmet expectations that we think like, oh, it's going to be like, I'm going to hear the angels singing and it's going to be this incredibly uplifting, inspiring experience. And then sometimes a person goes and it's a wall, and it's a wall that has a lot of history, but maybe it doesn't speak to them in the way that they expect. And that's a little bit the way that I often view Sefer Tehilim. At least for me personally, even as somebody who had the opportunity to teach it in high school many years ago, Sefer Tehilim is one of those books that you just have this expectation, because this is something that Jewish people, maybe even Jewish women more than Jewish men, but Jewish people, this is our book, this is our go-to. This is, you know, when good things happen, we say Tehillim. When bad things happen, we say Tehillim. It's supposed to be like, I don't know, I in my mind, I always pictured like no grandparent that I knew, but maybe a great grandparent on my side of the family, you know, sitting, knitting something and saying Tehillim. Like we have this visual in our minds that Sefer Tehillim is this treasure of the Jewish people, and that it's supposed to serve as this source of connection between us and God, between us and our, you know, our more spiritual selves. And I just think very often we're left a little bit wanting. You know, we think that we're going to get somewhere incredible, just like we think that first experience at the kotel is going to be like that. And then very often we start, much like with tefillah, with prayer in general, and we're sometimes left not as fulfilled as what we were hoping. I was blessed to have my husband, one of his grandmothers, two of his grandmothers, but one until very recently in our life. And that will forever be my image of her, is her just sitting and saying Tehillim, hours and hours on end. And every time she would tell us, as she moves into her 90s, every time she would say to us, I don't even know what I'm still doing here. I have no friends left. I have no family left my age. I don't know what I'm still doing here. I just assume Hashem says I need to be here because I'm supposed to be davening for all you people. That's what she would say, all you people. And daven she did, thank God. She really was somebody, she had a Tehillim in every corner of her room in the assisted living where she lived. And it was amazing to me to watch. I don't think she understood a lot of the words, but it was something that spoke to her in such a profound way. And I was so jealous of that internal, inherent connection, instinctual connection that she had to Tehillim. And I'm somebody who was blessed to have an Jewish education for many years more than she did. And I even taught Sefer Tehillim for a number of years in high school, and I still could never come close to the level of connection and passion that she felt. And so for many years, I was, you know, when you were supposed to say Tehillim, I said Tehillim. Most of us say Tehillim whenever we daven, because the chapters from Psalms have made their way into so much of our tefillah, of our typical prayer, our liturgy. But the idea of like being somebody who says Tehillim was not something that really spoke to me. And obviously there were times, different times, personal times in my life where maybe it did, but as a general rule, it was something that remains a bit of a mystery to me, even though I studied it and even though I taught it. And I will say that I think generally, I experienced the heaviness, the weight of the last 8-9 months, which of course we all know that we've been experiencing something that the world hasn't experienced in any of our lifetimes. But on top of that, one of the things, and you all know this, but I'm going to state the obvious, one of the things that has made the last 9 months so challenging is the fact that the regular things that people have to deal with in their lives continue to happen. It's not like all of a sudden everyone else's challenges and issues were put on hold while we have been dealing with the global pandemic. There has just been layers upon layers. And in particular, one person from our community who I had been davening for, but they had gotten some bad news right around the beginning of COVID, and a Tehilim WhatsApp group was started. And for whatever reason, it clicked for me and it became sort of a go-to. It became something that I found very stabilizing. When I had a few free minutes, rather than running first to Facebook or Instagram or one of the other many things I could waste my time on, I first clicked on the Tehilim WhatsApp group, said a couple of chapters of Tehilim, and then went back to whatever the day had to bring. And I think for whatever reason, the depth of the emotion, the depth of the fear, of the anxiety, and a lot of the emotions that I think many of us have been feeling on a daily basis, some days more than others. I found the words of David HaMelech, the words of Tehilim, really, they either were able to express my anxiety and my fear in a way that I was having a hard time articulating myself, or I found them very calming. And maybe it was a combination of the two. Maybe the fact that I finally had a vocabulary, I had a way to sort of put into words what I was feeling, that in and of itself had a calming influence, right? Because sometimes, and I think we know this with young children, so much of what makes them freak out is that they very often can't articulate what it is that they're experiencing. They can't feel it. Well, many of us have that same trouble. We might be a little older, but we have that same challenge. So let's take a look at Sefer Tehilim, just to give you just my goal, my plan for today. And I'm very much open to hearing what everybody wants. I encourage you, please type in the chat or send us an email and let me know what specifically, if there are specific chapters you want us to cover. But I'm definitely looking for your feedback. I want this to be as meaningful for all of us as it can be. So please definitely be in touch. And also a special shout out, thank you to Shira, who's managing the all the technology and on cue. A special thank you to Shira, as well as to the shul for giving us this opportunity, sort of giving us this platform to allow for women to learn like this together, even during these very weird times. Okay, so let's get started. What we're going to do today is really a lot of background. I am quite sure that one of the reasons why for so many of us Tehilim is a bit of a closed book, or why it's a bit mysterious, is because usually you're handed a couple of chapters, told to say it, and we're missing very often what's underlying what it is that we're saying. And just like if you were taking a course in literature, the professor would ask you to do some basic research on the author and on the historical context when that particular piece of literature was written, and all sorts of other background pieces that you would need in order to fully understand and experience the text that you're about to study. So I think we really need to do the same thing. So we will touch on a couple of quotes here and there from Tehilim, but for the most part for today, we're going to set the stage. We're going to get to know King David just a little bit, and hopefully go over some sources and share some ideas that I know were new to me, and I hope will be new and meaningful to you as well. So I wanted to start with an idea from Rav Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who has a beautiful, beautiful commentary on Psalms, on Tehilim. And in his introduction, which of course I read in the English translation because my German is as good as my French. I think that's what I usually say when I quote Rav Hirsch. So in Rav Hirsch's introduction to Sefer Tehilim, he makes a beautiful point. And I generally find this is a great way to start learning any book. And that is the title of the Sefer itself. Sefer Tehilim, or Psalms. Why is it called Tehilim? Why is it called Tehilim? Now, the word Tehillah generally is translated to mean praise, but it's a feminine word, Tehillah. And so really, if we're being accurate in our conjugations, This book that David HaMelech wrote would be called Sefer Tehilot, but it's called Sefer Tehilim. And Rabbi Hirsch points out that the same thing is true when it comes to tefillin. That tefillin, really, the singular is tefillah, and tefillin should really be called tefilot. But for the same reason, they're both conjugated the way that they are. And he explains as follows. He says that the pluralization of both tehillah and tefillah, even though it should be tehilot and tefillot, is written the way that it is, because by telling us tehilim, tefillin, which is really tefilim, but we say the Aramaic version of tefillin, that by saying it that way, that what we are saying is we're in process, in the same way that that people, like it's a statement of the present, that this is a means to an end, and that tehilot is already a very lofty goal. Tefillot is already a very lofty goal. We're not quite there yet. And what we need in order to reach a stage of tefillot or tehilot is to engage in this process of tefillin and Tehilim, and that the study that we do, I can't speak for the tefillin part, but the study that we do on Tehilim is really meant to get us to a place where our Tehilim become so much a part of who we are. They become part of the way we want to express ourselves. It becomes a part of our heart, a part of our mind, and that is eventually will get us to a place of tehilot. But in the meantime, we're in a process. There's a means to an end of Tehilim. In order for this to happen, like we said with any text, you have to be able to at least have a basic understanding, a basic translation of what it is that you're reading. We are so blessed to live in a time where there are more translations than you can know what to do with. You want to read the English under the words, across from the words, line by line, interlinear, like you name it, you can find a translation that works for you. I joke very often that sometimes you need an English dictionary to understand the English translation. Sometimes the Hebrew is a little easier, but today you can actually find translations that are user-friendly. It's important to note that so many of them are very often not literal translations, but they're based on some of the commentaries. So for example, if you read the Art Scroll translation of Tehilim, it's not a literal translation. It's really based on the commentary of Rashi, as Art Scroll almost always is, unless they tell you otherwise. There are other ones that are based on Onkelos, on the Aramaic translation. They're always, like, everybody sort of has their own little take on it. Just like if you and I were to translate a sentence from Hebrew to English or French to English, it generally would not be exactly the same. We would each have our own biases. So too, when it comes to a translation, it's always good to find one that really speaks to you, because they're all accurate and they're not all perfectly accurate, if that makes sense. They're all coming from slightly different perspectives. So today we're blessed that we can find a translation. So getting the basic understanding, I don't want to say it's simple, because we don't all take the time to do it, but it's attainable, right? It's very accessible. What becomes then our job is, once we know the translation, and we have heard from a number of our Israeli friends who've come to Montreal, this is such a source of frustration for their kids when they come into an environment outside of Israel, where for us, just getting through the translation of the text in and of itself is part of our study, right? That's part of the process we have to go through. But if Hebrew is your native tongue, translating is like such a wasted amount of time. So their poor children come to our day schools in North America, and all we're doing is reading to them what they already understood. Like, we're spending all this time trying to understand what the words mean. And of course, thank God for them, it's much more intuitive. So for us, first we have to get on the basic translation. And then of course, we want to get a little bit deeper. We want to begin to understand, why did King David choose these words? Like, what was going on for him that made him reference that other situation that took place? Or what made him reference a quote from another place in Tanakh? What was he trying to tell us? And I think most importantly, is to figure out, what was he feeling? Like, what was going on for him emotionally? And how does that then connect with where I am in my life? And David HaMelech was a highly unusual personality, a I mean, just there aren't words to describe his passion, his fire. We will look at a few sources to sort of, but we're really only going to scratch the surface. If we had so much time, and we all had hours and hours to spend, we really should study Sefer Shmuel, the book of Samuel, to get a real understanding for the life of King David. But what we're going to do is study Tehilim, which you really have to do the two together to understand what he was feeling. If you think about it, in every other character that you know of in the Torah, for example, these weeks in the Parshiot, we're reading about Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. In the Torah, every once in a while will give us like a tidbit as to what the person is feeling. That Leah doesn't feel as loved as Rachel. We'll get that. But what's really going on in the minds of Leah, you generally have to either guess, or you have to look at Torah Sheba'al Peh. You have to look at the Midrashim to understand. What's fascinating about David HaMelech, about King David, is that he wrote down for us what he was feeling. And when you study both Sefer Shmuel, the Navi, plus Tehilim at the same time, you very often get another layer of understanding that you don't have with any other book of Tanakh. There's not any other book that I'm aware of where a person was written about or wrote one thing and then gave you the backstory somewhere else from an emotional standpoint, right? We have Divrei Hayamim, we have other books that will supplement information, but what makes Tehillim so engaging, I think, is the fact that it is all emotion. It's the expression of every emotion that a human being can experience. And what's I think quite unique about David HaMelech is that he is no holds barred. He holds nothing back. He is, I think, in today's lingo, in today's terminology, right, we would say that he is very comfortable being vulnerable. He is totally okay sharing his deepest and often darkest fears, pain, his crises, his existential crises, his religious crises, his issues with his family, deep seated challenges that he doesn't hold back from sharing with us. And it's not because he was in it for the public attention, right? That's actually a fight that he has with his wife, Michal. Excuse me, just to mention one story, we'll go back and forth with a few stories, but one famous story about David in the book of Shmuel is for the first time in many, many years, the Aron, the Holy Ark, is being brought back for the first time to Yerushalayim. This is sort of part of the process of the building of the Beit HaMikdash, which we know doesn't happen until David's son is the king. But it's finally, the Aron is finally making its way back to Yerushalayim. And David HaMelech has been waiting his whole life for this. He is in a state of ecstasy. I don't know how else to describe it. To the point that he dances, the Navi describes, he is mecharker. He is dancing. He looks a little bit like a crazy person. He looks perhaps like he's under the influence of some kind of influence. What's the word I'm looking for? Not a narcotic or an alcohol, but some kind of substance. That's the word I'm looking for. Some kind of substance that has brought out a side in him that certainly his wife Michal has never seen. And what follows is a very kind of unpleasant exchange between David and his wife Michal, where she says to him, like, where I come from, which is royalty, right? Her father was Shaul, the first king. Where I come from, kings don't do that in public. Kings don't dance like that. And unfortunately, what as often happens when somebody gives you like a little dig is that David responds with a dig in response. And he says to her, well, your like the malchut is now with me, right? The kingdom is now with me. It's not with your father. So this is the way to do things. This is the way to go. And what we understand with David is that if there is something that he can do, if there's a part of himself that he can share, he's going to do it in an effort to connect the Jewish people to Hashem. So if he sees that his passionate dancing, singing, carrying on in public is going to be a source of not just inspiration, but it's going to show the people that that amount of passion is possible in your relationship with God, then he's going to do it. Whether he needed it for himself or not is almost not the point. He was constantly mindful of in his role as not just the leader of the Jewish people, but almost like the expression of the Jewish people. Let them see that this is okay, and it will impact them as well. let's take a look at the beginning of the life of David HaMelech, and I hope we'll get a chance to go through all the sources. If not, we can certainly finish up next time. But I'd like to just start with what I perceive to be maybe the deepest pain of David HaMelech's life. And when I say that not lightly, because David HaMelech suffered, the Midrash says, arguably more than any other character in Tanakh. I think generally when you ask people who suffered the most in Tanakh, generally they'll tell you Eov, right? They'll tell you Job, because that's like, he's the king of suffering. The whole book is about how he suffered. But the Midrash actually puts David in that category, and maybe even holds him a bit higher or lower. I don't know how we would explain it, but that he was really the one who suffered in ways that we can't wrap our heads around. We won't go through, like I said, we can't go through all the details of his life, but if there was a human experience of suffering, David HaMelech experienced it. And I mean that from every aspect of human suffering. I mean that from a woman's perspective. I mean that from a man's perspective. He felt and experienced the depth of pain like no other person that we meet in all of Tanakh. And the Navi is not shy to share with us each and every experience that he has in the realm of his marriage, with his children. He loses a child. He loses more than one child. He has fighting amongst his children. He has enemies. He is really like, he escapes with his life so many times. He lives his life on the run. But I think that maybe it just speaks to me so much, but I do think at the root of all of this pain comes from even before he's born. So what I want to do is sort of share, let me share my screen, is to share some of the sources that talk about that part. And the reason why I think this is so important is because when we talk about pain and suffering, obviously every person in their life, there is no person that is immune from suffering. Unfortunately, it's just not possible. But when we talk about a profound level of pain that then influences every other experience of pain, I think that's something that's really worth focusing on. So even though we're not going to spend the time going through each and every story that happens in David HaMelech's life with his wives or his children, etc., but what I do want to spend some time on is going back to the very beginning, because I think what we learn from that experience, the way the Midrash talks to us about David, I think will help us understand all the other pain that we will see in the rest of his 70 years of life. So the first source that we have here, it's actually a picture because I couldn't find it online, but I had it in an old source sheet of mine. So before source one, but right here, this picture. So this is a midrash that tells the story of the background of how David HaMelech came to be. I think that this might be familiar to some of you, so I'll go through it pretty quickly, and then I'll share another midrash that I just recently found for the first time, so I think it's maybe a little less known, and we'll do that one in a bit more depth. So this first source here is from the Yalkut Shimoni, is based on a story about Adam, about the first man, right? That he was shown Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam, Havir Lefanav Kol Hadarot. Okay, so Adam and Hashem are having some kind of conversation, and Hashem is showing Adam a book of all the generations to come. And he shows him, he's like flipping pages, soul after soul after soul. And then he shows him Herahu David. He shows him the soul of David, whatever that means, that there is a soul of a human being in the page of a book. Chakukin lo gimel shaot, that David was destined to live. He was allotted 3 hours. Now, right away, with a little bit of knowledge about what happened during creation, we know why this jumps out at Adam. The reason why this likely jumps out at Adam is that maybe there was something unique and special about the Neshama of David, probably. But the idea that he was given 3 hours, I think, is probably what grabs his attention the most. When Adam himself was created, he was created in the 9th hour of the 6th day. So the 9th hour of Friday. He had 3 hours. 3 hours to just hang in there, not eat from the tree, and then the Shabbos, not just regular Shabbos, but like the Shabbos to beat all Shabbatot would have come, and the world would have entered a state of perfection. But as we know, Adam was busy making some mistakes during those 3 hours. And he had 3 hours, and it was his mistake that took place in those 3 hours that caused a transformation in the world that he never really fully, I mean, we never recovered from it, but he also never recovered from it. And so he asks Hashem, Amar lefanav ribono shel olam, lo tehei takana lazeh? Like, can't we do something to fix this? Kach alta b'machshava lefanai. And Hashem answers him, no, this is what I was thinking. This is my plan. My plan is to give David 3 hours. So Adam responds, Kama shnei chayai, how long am I supposed to live? So Hashem answers him, Elaf shanim, you're destined to live 1,000 years. So then Adam follows up, Amar le, yesh matana berakia, is it possible to give gifts up there in the heavens? Like, are you allowed to, give presents? Amar le, hen, sure, you can give presents up here, no problem. So he says, great. Amar le, ayin shanim mishnotai, yihiyu lemazal zeh. Ayin shanim, 70 years, mishnotai, from my life, yihiyu lemazal zeh, should go to this. Mazal here doesn't really mean like constellation, but it means, right, to this neshama. Wow. And you'll see when you read Sefer Breshit that Adam HaRishon does live 930 years, right? He gives 70 years of his life to David. Ma asa Adam, what did he do? He via tashtar. Okay, this part I won't go into here because it's a little less significant for what we need. But what David basically does is he writes it up in a contract. He signs, he makes Hashem sign, he gets another witness, another angel to sign, and he signs over 70 years of his life. And then he decides he needs to give David 2 other gifts also. He gives him the gifts of malchut, of leadership, of kingship, and zmirot, the ability to, not just to sing, but the ability to conduct. And this will play a major, major role in what David HaMelech, what he composes within Sefer Tehilim, because we're going to see Tehilim is not just words. Tehilim was really meant to be played and sung to music. And our understanding is, while we have lost, unfortunately, the tunes, and we've even lost most of the instruments. Like, you'll see translations, but most of them are not, they're not actually the instruments that were. That's, even though we don't have that anymore, that's how it was meant to be. It wasn't just meant to be studied. It was meant to be sung. It was meant to be performed. And as we'll see, as we go through some of the Tehillim over the course of the weeks that we hopefully will study together, so we'll see that some of them were written, David specifically wrote them with the intention that they be sung at different points during different parts of the service in the Beit HaMikdash, so that even though he himself would not live to see the building of the temple, but that his music, his words, his lyrics, his songs would be what was performed there. So it's sort of like, right, this was going to be his legacy, not just like, oh, this will be the family song. These will be the songs of the Jewish people. So that's one midrash that sort of tells us David HaMelech was never really destined to live very long anyway. He was going to be a couple of hours, and he was going to be what we would say in our terminology today, right? His parents were going to experience very early infant loss. Right? He was going to be alive for 3 hours and he was going to die. And he ends up living 70 years. What I want to share with you is another midrash that I found, but I didn't actually find it, which is why I didn't put it on the source sheet. I found it quoted in a very reliable source in Yishai Tanakh, a sefer written by, I forget his name, Yishai Chasida, which is a very reliable book, but I wasn't able to find the original source. So I'm just going to share it with you. Listen to this mind-blowing midrash, and then I want to sort of look at the one we just did and the one we're about to do and understand what we're meant to grasp about David and his existential pain that he always was experiencing. So the midrash shares with us that David came to be in a very unusual way, different from this story, that as you may be aware, the lineage of David HaMelech, his great-grandmother, who was Ruth, that at one point, her conversion was called into question, really at more than just one point. The idea that Jewish people will, ask inappropriate questions about each other's lineage is not new. Unfortunately, this is something that has gone on for many, many years. And even though everything was done properly and according to Halacha, the people were talking. And at one point, David's father, Yishai, who was a very righteous man, was under the impression that his marriage to his Jewish wife was not halachically acceptable. He called into question almost his own yichus, his own lineage. And here he was married to a Jewish woman, and he had a fear that he was violating a very basic Torah principle. What he does then is actually it reminds us of the story of Moshe, and the parallels between Moshe and David are many, many, many. One of them is this idea that David, who are to be David's parents, they end up separating, just like Moshe's parents, for different reasons, but they end up separating from each other. But Yishai was a very righteous man, and Yishai wanted to bring as much goodness and holiness into the world as possible, but he just was under the impression now that he wasn't sure if he was Jewish or not, and therefore he didn't want to live in this immoral situation of being married to this Jewish woman. And so, but he knew he had this obligation to bring children into the world, to raise righteous people, to bring holiness. He had this obligation. This is something he had to do. And he was stuck. He didn't know how to handle it because it couldn't be with this woman that he already had many, many children with and had been his wife for many years. It couldn't be with her because their marriage was perhaps not legitimate. So he separates from her and he goes through, the Midrash describes in detail, I'll just leave out. He basically takes one of his non-Jewish servants, frees her, and then marries her. All conditional, all according to whatever. If he was Jewish, he did it according to Jewish law, but he's working on the assumption that he's not Jewish. And he tells the woman, he tells this servant of his, what his plan is, right? This is what we're going to do. And tonight, you and I will get married. And tonight you'll become my wife. We'll live together as husband and wife. You're going to be the mother of my next children to come. Now, this woman, who the Midrash does not tell us her name, but this woman feels a tremendous sense of loyalty, of dedication to her mistress, to David's original wife. And the whole plan doesn't sit well with her. So she goes and she tells David's wife the plan. And now we have like a Rachel Leah story, because she says to her, this is the plan. What should we do? And David's wife, Yishai's wife is heartbroken. What do you mean he's going to take another woman? He's so misguided that he thinks we're not supposed to be together. Of course we're supposed to be together. Of course he's Jewish. Of course everything is fine. But she knows arguing with him won't get her anywhere. So they make a switch, the way Lavan does with Yaakov, with Rachel and Leah. She and the servant, they switch. And the difference in the story is that Yishai, according to the Midrash, Yishai doesn't know. She never tells him. And what happens is he had separated from his wife, and then he sees after a few months that his wife is pregnant, right? The wife that he is no longer married to. And this creates quite a problem. We know, of course, that the way our halachic marriages, the way our moral, ethical relationships today work is not the same way that it did back then. So for a man to have several wives, many of whom could be pregnant at the same time, was not a problem. But if a woman was separated from her husband and becomes pregnant, so it's obvious that there was some kind of adulterous relationship that happened, meaning she wasn't divorced from her husband, she was estranged or separated from her husband. So the whole thing is just confusing because they were still technically married, but you see the problem. So she becomes pregnant, she delivers the child, and as the Midrash says, Yishai and all of his other sons, he has 8 other sons, nobody ever says a word. They never talk about it. It's like, today there's all this study about Brene Brown, a social worker, very famous podcast and books that she's written. She talks a lot about shame and about how it's one thing when people make mistakes, but then when we don't talk about it, when there's pain in a relationship and we don't talk about it, it just breeds so much more pain and suffering because there's shame around it. So what happens is that nobody ever talks about it. They never talk about who the father of this baby could possibly be. And of course, the wife gives birth, and it's David HaMelech, the future King David. And his whole life, he walks around knowing that something is wrong with how he came into the world. It doesn't seem like anyone ever told him. The Midrash doesn't explain how they handled it. What did it look like at the dinner table? How did they treat David? But what we know from the Navi is that David is always a second thought in this family. He is never treated the way the other brothers are treated. We'll see that in the next few sources. And what we see is that not until Shmuel, the prophet Shmuel, Samuel, who comes to anoint the next king, it's not until, the Midrash says, he literally pours the oil on David's head that everybody, it all clicks, like that it all comes together. Oh my gosh, this has to be our father's son. It has to be, because everybody knew the king was going to come from Yishai, right? The next king had to descend from Ruth, who had to descend, right? Oved, Yishai, and then it was David. But they had never discussed it. It was never something that was processed as a family. It was just the shameful, horrible secret, according to the Midrash, that for 20 some odd years, until David is anointed as king, was never talked about. Now, the reason why I thought it was important to bring this, first of all, it's a mind-blowing story, is that in general, I think our approach to Midrash can be, many different things. There are a few schools of thought when it comes to Midrash. So one of them is, of course, you take every Midrash literally. If the Midrash says that's what happened, then that's what happened. And that's a perfectly legitimate school of thought. The Rambam, Maimonides, has a slightly different approach where he says, you don't have to take them all so literally. They're all true, but they're not all literal. And that what very often Chazal, what our sages are trying to do when they tell us stories like this, is to teach us something, is to tell us something. So I don't necessarily know what the lessons are, but I can tell you what my guess is. And I think a lot of it is probably based on our experience, our collective experience over the last 9 months, which is that when people are in pain and people are struggling with certain things, there's layers to it. And very often the struggle started so much earlier on than any of us are aware of. Certainly we're not aware of it in each other, but we're not even aware of it in ourselves, right? David HaMelech at different points in Tehilim is going to say things like, Bechet yechamatni imi, I was conceived in sin. It's like such a crazy thing to say. You were conceived in sin? Like, what does that mean? Or he says, Imi va'avi azavuni, right? My parents have abandoned me. Like, where does that come from? That is such a profound statement. As parents, you think like, oh my gosh, David wrote that. He published that. You aired all the family drama, all the dirty laundry. And I think one lesson, there's probably so much, but one lesson that we can take from these midrashim and sort of how they work together is that what we understand about David HaMelech is that his experience of pain is so profound. It's not something, it goes beyond him. It goes beyond his life experience. We know all the stories that happen in the Navi that are super painful, difficult, rejection and suffering, illness, all the things, loss, all of that. But I think maybe what Chazal are telling us is that very often a person's suffering, a person's pain is so deep down, there's like a heaviness there, there's a gaping hole. And all of the other pain and suffering in their life is really just layered upon that. We don't always know that it's there, but that very often that feeling of loneliness, of isolation, this existential crisis that we will see David expresses throughout Sefer Tehillim, of just like to feel that you don't have, your parents don't have your back. You don't have that most basic fundamental. Now we know, unfortunately, this is the reality. Some people are not raised by the kinds of parents who give them that sense, but it's certainly not ideal, right? That's certainly not what we want, not for ourselves, not for our children, not for anybody, not for anyone's children. But the profound nature of the pain of David, and I think the profound nature of the pain of human beings is such that it goes much deeper than what we really understand. It started before we came into the world, that inherently there is a certain sense of isolation, of loneliness, that is very normal for people to feel. I'm not saying that that makes it okay, or that it means it doesn't need to be, treated and cared for. All the more so, that's what it requires. But that it's nobody's fault. It's not because, oh, this person went through this experience and therefore they have a heaviness or a seriousness about them, or a loneliness, or a sense of despair. this is the kind of thing that goes on before a person potentially is even brought into the world, is what I think Chazal are telling us. And the pain that David therefore is able to express in Tehillim is based on that kind of pain, the deepest, darkest kind of pain that a human can experience. And I think that's one of the things that makes Tehillim so it's so universal. The language of the pain is so universal because, as we're going to see as we go through the Prakim of Tehillim, the way David wrote it is that it should never be that a person would open up a parak of Tehillim and say like, oh, well, I would never have that experience. This doesn't speak to me. As we'll see, every parak of Tehillim is written in a very the emotions are real and raw, and they're written about in detail, and they're written about passionately and articulately. But the circumstances that David was experiencing are almost never mentioned. The only time you'll see David make a historical or personal reference to his own life is in the first line of the parak. After that, you will never get a personal anything from David. And this speaks again to the universal nature of what, as we'll get through the rest of the sheet, I hope, this universal nature of connection, and that everything should be relatable, that David wrote. And so he makes it very non-specific, which is, let's say, the opposite of Tfilat Chana, right? Chana, who says this magnificent, gorgeous prayer asking for a child, and then this magnificent, gorgeous prayer when she is granted her child. You could say that anytime, but it's a little bit more limited in the sense that it's an appropriate thing to say, for a woman to share that, to read those psukim, maybe as a way to bless her children, or to ask for children, or to express her gratitude for her children. It kind of would be a weird thing to use if a person wants to express gratitude about something else, because it's so specific to her becoming a mother. Whereas the language of David, and of course there's a time and a place for that, no question, but the language of David is never that specific. So that, let's say, a woman in that same circumstance who is yearning and wanting a child, or is feeling so overwhelmingly grateful for the gift of her child, she could open up virtually any of the 150 chapters of Tehillim and find her words there, as opposed to the words of Hannah, which are magnificent, but are much more specific. They don't lend themselves to the kinds of personal experience that the language of Tehillim does. And that is really the goal of David HaMelech, is that we should be able to open it up and find ourselves, find our emotion, find our experience in his words. So as we scroll down the source sheet, and I'm going to zip through this part a little bit, sources 1 and 2 are just describing what happens, short excerpts, what happens when David is chosen. One of the things you see, you can read the English or the Hebrew in front of you, but one of the things that we see is that Shmuel himself, who is a Navi, a prophet, at this point, the greatest Jew of his generation, that even he is confused by who the next king should be. He's positive that it's the oldest son of Yishai who looks like a king. He just has that look. You all know what I mean, right? There are some people that just look presidential. They don't always end up becoming president, but they look presidential. And then some people who don't look so presidential end up becoming president. But he is totally just, he's taken in by the physical appearance of this one son of Yishai. And Hashem has to say to him, oh, no. That's not the guy, right? And there's a whole explanation to what disqualified him. And ki ha'adam yir'eh einayim v'Hashem yir'eh levav. It's one of my most favorite psukim in all of Tanakh. Man sees with his eyes, but God sees straight to a person's heart, right? We are all so easily taken in by external appearances. And in the world of Hashem, it means almost nothing. I don't say it means nothing, but it means almost nothing, right? That the outside is only to Hashem is a reflection of the inside. It's not something separate at all. David is anointed. It describes the way he looks. This will become something that is relevant for us at different points. So I'll just highlight this one phrase here. Let me highlight it. Nope. He is, here it is. V'hu admoni im yefei einayim v'tov ro'i. Hopefully we're okay. V'hu admoni. How does it describe David? He is a redhead, im yefei einayim, with beautiful eyes, which will likely mean not just the fact that he had beautiful eyes to look at, and he was quite good looking, as it tells us, tov ro'i, but that he had beautiful eyes, he saw beauty, right? It's not just that he had the kinds of eyes that you wanted to get lost in, which no doubt he did, but that eyes were, they perceived the beauty in the world. And you see, as you go through Tehilim, I hope we'll get a chance to do some of these prakim together, appreciation for nature. He loved physical beauty. V'tov ro'i, also the same. He was good looking, but he also had a positive view, meaning his glasses were positive glasses. He saw good. And we know this has to be the case because the way David suffered so much in his life, for him to be David HaMelech and to produce a Sefer Tehilim, it had to be that his filter was a very positive one. He had to see the good. Okay, one other pasuk. Where the famous statement that this is written at the very end of David HaMelech's life, right? That he is the Hukama Mashiach and Ne'im Zmirot Yisrael. He is the sweet singer of Israel. As the Midrash here says, which I didn't bring, that everyone who was qualified wanted to write Tehilim, meaning Sefer Tehilim it had to be written. We needed the book of Tehilim. And there was a long line of people up in heaven who wanted to write it. But David was the one who was in the Midrash because Ne'im Zmirot Yisrael, he had the most pleasant way of expressing himself, and that's why he was chosen. Let's look at a couple other sources just to sort of bring the whole picture of David HaMelech together. The Rambam Maimonides, in one of his laws describing the king and what is required of the king. So he goes through all the details, the technicalities, what he is allowed to have, what he's not allowed to have, what he has to do every single day of his life, what he's not allowed to do. It is so specific and actually quite fascinating. There were so many requirements. I mean, we all know positions of leadership and power be overwhelming, but he didn't just have to be the king. He also had to be like the perfect sample of a good-looking, well-cared-for, well-groomed individual. And the reason for all that, why he had to walk around with the Sefer Torah, and why he needed his haircut, and why he had to be shaved every single day, and why, he was never allowed to have a stain on his clothes, God forbid, fresh clothes every day, brand new. All these details is for the following reason. Shelibo hu lev kol kahal Yisrael, because his heart was the heart of the Jewish people. That's it. They were inextricably linked. What went on for the king was going to go on for the people, and vice versa. But really, the influence was going in that direction. This line, if ever there was a king that it could be said about, it was King David. It was David HaMelech. He felt this with every breath that he took and every word that he said and every word that he wrote, which was that if this is what I'm thinking, if this is what I'm feeling, if this is how I'm connecting to God, if this is how I'm praying, if this is how I'm, interacting with the people in my family and the palace and the nation, this is going to be reflected in the people themselves. And the Rambam explains that's why lefichach dibkoa katuv batorah yeter misharham. That's why there are so many lofty expectations of the king. Like I said before, he's not allowed to go more than his Dalet Amot. He's not like today, put your kippah on, put your kippah on. The king couldn't walk a Sefer Torah. He was attached to a Sefer Torah, which tells us that was his job. His job was to be a living, breathing Torah, right? His job was to be a constant source of connection between the Jewish people and Hashem, a conduit, right? Not to take the place, God forbid, or anything like that, but to be a constant reminder of what was possible for a human being. That was the king's job, and nobody took this job more seriously than David HaMelech. Just share a couple of more. So the Midrash in Tehilim in source number 4 tells us that when David HaMelech wrote Tehilim, Kol ma she'amar David, everything that he said, b'sifro, in his book, meaning Tehilim, kenegdo ukeneged kol Yisrael, Keneged kol ha'itim, right? This is what we were saying before. This is really the source for what I said before. That David HaMelech, when he wrote the book of Tehilim, his intention was, it wasn't just true for himself and his own experience, but that it would be true for the entire people, and it would be true for every future generation. Keneged kol ha'itim, all the times that were yet to come, it would still be relevant. He took this also seriously, that the Gemara, I won't read this one inside, but the Gemara in Brachot talks about, very famous, right? Everybody knows about this idea of Kinur David, David's harp. So this Gemara talks about the harp that hung over his bed that woke him every night at midnight, and he would rise from his bed and he would study Torah until the morning. Some of the commentaries on the Gemara talk about how this was really, this the epitome of David, that generation, that really their leader was putting even more hours into the Beit Midrash than they were. There was nobody who studied harder than David HaMelech. And of course, that was meant to inform all the decisions he made and to build his character, which we will spend quite a bit of time talking about. Just a couple of more I'm going to try to get in before we wrap up. What was the hope of David HaMelech? So we said he wanted it to be relevant for everyone, but he didn't just want it to be relevant. He wanted it to be potent. He wanted it to be powerful. And this is one of my favorite quotes about the hopes and dreams, the aspirations of David when he wrote Sefer Tehilim. Here, this is in source 6. This is like the prayer of David. V'al yihiyu korimbo kekorim b'sifrei me'or. I want it to be studied the way they would study text. I don't want it to be read the way you like casually begin. And over and over again, right? Over and over and over again, which is, of course, what has become of Sefer Tehilim. V'notzlim schar alehem, and they should be rewarded for it. Kinegayim v'ohalot. Now, what is that referring to? So this is basically referencing the laws of Tuma and Tahara, the laws of when a person can go to the Beit HaMikdash and not, when a person is tahor, when they're tameh, when they have access to the temple or to their spouse, all those laws of Tuma and Tahara. David said, that's what I want Tehilim to be like. I want it to be that they have to study it because they got to know the intricate details because it's part of their everyday life, right? For us, unfortunately, this isn't so relatable because even for women who are fortunate, perhaps to keep one aspect of these laws within the laws of Tahara Mishpacha, Nida, Mikvah, etc., it's not something that takes over your everyday life every single day of your life. But when there was a Beit HaMikdash, whether you were Tameh or Tahor, was ever present in your mind. You needed to know if to attend your best friend's son's bar mitzvah, if you woke up, going to do, right? So there was a constant awareness, a constant focus on the details of the laws of Tuma and Tahara. And David wanted that to be the experience of studying Sefer Tehilim, that you're not just going to say it, you're going to say it and you're going to need to know all the details because it's so relevant to your life. And he didn't just ask for it should be like Tuma and Tahara for that reason, but also I think what he was saying is it should have that same effect, right? It should be something that is cleansing. It should be something that is purifying. It should be something that after a person studies it or says it, that they feel like they're not the same person they were before. There should be something transformative. The way that a person goes from being Tameh to Tahor, the words of Tehilim should be transformative in that same way. And this is my, I can't talk about David HaMelech and not share this other Gemara. This Gemara talks about how Hashem he's sitting in judgment of David for something. And David says to him, Hashem, don't you know that I'm so good? Lo chasirani, am I not like such a righteous person? Shekol malchei mizrachu marab yoshvim agudot bichvodam. Every other king, every other national leader, well, they sit on their throne and they have meetings and they sit separate. They're like with the elite, right? They only agudot. They only hang out with their kind. They don't associate with the regular people because of their honor, right? They hold of themselves to be very honorable. Va'ani, but me, yadai meluchlachot b'dam. You know what my hands are busy with? With blood. Uveshvir u'shilia. Now, those are the Aramaic terms for a placenta, for other things related to women's, unfortunately, to a miscarriage or a loss of a pregnancy. And why was he busy looking at blood and dealing with these kinds of intimate parts of a woman's life? All those other kings, they're like, drinking scotch and having fancy meetings with other fancy people. And do you know what I do? I sit at the gates of the palace, have all these women come to me with their most intimate, personal, private questions. And I'm there just trying to help the woman keep halacha and become tahora. I'm hardly sitting, in a back room somewhere, smoking a cigar and just hanging out with the guys. I engage with the people. What's important to me is that your people keep your Torah, that your people keep your mitzvot. And not only that, the process of a human being becoming tahor, right? We know there's nothing bad about being tamei. There's nothing negative about it. It's just the way that a person is for that temporary time. But we know very much that we want a person to become tahor because they're able to do certain mitzvot that they can't do when they're tamei. So that's what I'm busy with. That's what I'm busy with, says David HaMelech. Okay, up until this point, we've really seen a bunch of sources, mostly from Torah Shabbal Peh, from the Midrash and from the Gemara, that give us an understanding of where David HaMelech was coming from when he wrote Sefer Tehilim. Not only about his own life experience and what might have informed some of his writing, some of his ability to articulate and express himself so magnificently, is not just because, again, of his life experiences, but also because of things that happened that were part of his consciousness almost before he even came into this world, a level of pain that allowed him to have an empathy for other people that is really unmatched in all of Tanakh. There is nobody else who is able to express the depth of a human being's pain the way David HaMelech can, and that his goal was to make his pain meaningful. Some of you have probably heard that I very often quote Dr. David Kessler. He's a grief expert, a psychologist. He did a lot of the work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was, she came up with the five, not came up with, that doesn't make it sound official enough, but they suggested the 5 stages of death and dying and of mourning. Dr. David Kessler, who is still very much alive and is very active on social media and has been doing incredibly wonderful mental health work during the pandemic. He actually, with the family's permission of Dr. Kubler-Ross, added a 6th level to the 5 levels, which is finding meaning, finding purpose in the suffering, which is something for anybody who has experienced a tragedy, a loss, is something that for many people happens decades later. Which he himself talks about after the loss of his own child. One of the things that I think David HaMelech is trying to give us is this sense that you can turn all of your pain and all of your suffering into something meaningful when you are able to be there for someone else. Right? Here's David HaMelech saying, I suffered in ways nobody else should suffer. I suffered in ways that is so much a part of me, I'm not even fully aware of it. I don't even understand it. But it wasn't for nothing. It can't be for nothing. It is what allowed me to become this person that could write a book that would be a script, that would be a source of healing and a source of support for everyone that was going to come after me, right? And that's this model of empathy that David HaMelech becomes for us. He's not just this, military leader, which he is, and he's not just a Torah scholar, which he is. And he's not just a poet or a lyricist or a musician. He's all of those things. But what he is above all else is a human being with a capacity to feel the pain of others and support other people. And that's really as a result of his own personal suffering, his own personal experience. And therefore, the way that he writes and the way that he prays that his writing should be accepted by the Jewish people and by Hashem himself is with this goal in mind. Let me connect the people to you, Hashem. Let me be there to support them, to give them the tools that they need to connect to you, preferably through joy. And there is tons of joy in Sefer Tehilim. In fact, it's one of the most remarkable things about David is how he can go from the heights of joy to the depths of despair in one pasuk. It seems like in seconds, he can go from one to the next. So of course, he wants to give us the language that we need. He gave us Hallel. He gave us our greatest, most uplifting words of gratitude and thanks, an articulate expression that very often we ourselves can't find. So thank God we have Hallel. But he also gave us the same expression for when we're feeling down and despair, isolation, loneliness, and all of that. And that, again, is all based on his experience. And that is all that he wanted. That's it. That was his goal. So I think we'll stop here for today. What I'd like to do, again, with your feedback, so please feel free to be in touch with myself or with Shira. And what I'm going to start with next time is just some basic rules of how Tehillim were written. But then I want to sort of hear from all of you. Do you want to study a specific chapter, or should we just do bits and pieces from all over? Like, I'm happy to do either one. I want this to be something that's meaningful for all of us. So if you want to just share your ideas, share your feedback, we would love to hear from you. It was a special treat to learn with all of you this morning, and I wish you